Within the animal kingdom, there are organisms that reproduce sexually and organisms that reproduce asexually. Asexually just means you're making genetically identical copies of yourself, and sexually means that you have to get with another organism and you have to mix your DNA somehow. That generally involves two gametes, a sperm and an egg, coming together to form a diploid zygote. Maybe the simplest way to reproduce asexually is just to divide yourself in two, and then both halves grow up and become adult individuals of about the same size. But there are other ways to go about doing it too. Budding is an example where, for instance, in a hydra, a new hydra grows off the side of an old hydra. Eventually it'll fall off and grow into an adult. This would be like if I had a little mark growing off my shoulder, and it would grow there until it got big enough that it would fall off, and there you have two marks. Fragmentation is similar, but it means you've broken off a body piece, and then that can develop into an adult. So it's just example of this would be sponges can do this, or some planarians, for example. Parthenogenesis is also something that you'll find in some organisms, especially rotifers, where a female will lay an egg that's diploid. So typically eggs are haploid. They only have one set of chromosomes. They need a sperm to create a diploid zygote. Here, you just lay a diploid egg, and that egg grows into an adult that comes from the same genetic makeup as the mother, and males are not needed. That's parthenogenesis. And you might think, logically, that asexual reproduction makes a lot more sense. First of all, you don't have to find somebody else to go do it. You can do it all by yourself, and if your genes are good, and presumably if you're reproducing in a particular environment, you have genes that make you good at reproducing in that environment. So why would you want your offspring to only have half of your genes and half of somebody else's genes? Doesn't make sense. Plus, there's something called the twofold cost of sexual reproduction. If only females can reproduce, well, then if everyone is female and able to reproduce, then let's say that every individual has 2 offspring per generation. Could be more, could be less, but we'll make the math easy. Both of those offspring can then reproduce themselves, and all of their offspring can reproduce themselves, etc., etc. Whereas if you reproduce sexually, if you're a female, only half of your offspring are going to be daughters on average, and only the daughters can then have new offspring, and so you're making twice as many offspring if you're asexual, twofold, hence the twofold price of sexual reproduction. So how in the world does any animal evolve sexual reproduction? And the answer is that there are some benefits, namely genetic variation. So in a static environment that's not changing, it makes sense for your offspring to have all of your genes, and maybe that's beneficial if you had good genes. But the environment typically isn't static. It's dynamic. It changes across generations, at least a little bit. And if you, let's say, are really good at growing, if you're a fast-growing organism, or let's say you're a plant, fast-growing tree, but you're not very efficient with water, that doesn't matter if you're in a wet environment. But let's say the environment dries out a little bit. Then you may not be so fit in that next generation, or your offspring might not be. So having a variation amongst your offspring hedges your bets. Sexual reproduction is a big bet hedger. It also allows you to reshuffle DNA, and occasionally you get something new and cool that pops out of that. There have been studies that have looked at this and looked at organisms that can reproduce both sexually and asexually. And in static environments, they tend to reproduce asexually. In dynamic environments, they tend to reproduce sexually. If you look at sister species, one of which is sexually reproducing and the other which is asexual, and you compete them together in an environment. In a dynamic environment, the sexually reproducing species tends to win out, versus in a static environment, often the asexually reproducing species wins out. So it's all about genetic diversity, which over the long term can help your offspring win out. Very often, sexually reproducing organisms have reproductive cycles. This means that they're not just continuously reproducing whenever they want to. We're familiar with that in humans. We have a monthly cycle of menstruation in females, of ovulation and menstruation. But a lot of organisms have, for instance, seasonal cycles, where they may reproduce in the spring, or in the wet season, or the dry season, or whatever it may be. And there are often environmental cues that stimulate ovulation. That could be longer days or warmer days, or something about the changing seasons. As we mentioned earlier, some organisms can reproduce either sexually or asexually, and it often depends upon the environment or upon parts of their life cycle. For instance, a lot of cnidarians reproduce asexually as a polyp. They produce lots and lots of medusae, but then the medusa produces sperm and egg and allows them to reproduce sexually, so they get a little bit of the benefits of both. Another way that you can get over the issue of having to find another organism is hermaphrodism. So you may still have to find another organism, but you have twice the population to work with, right? Because if you are an earthworm, for instance, and you make both male and female gametes, then any old earthworm you come across, you are able to inseminate, and vice versa. They're able to inseminate you. And so, again, you don't have the population of individuals that you can mate with. Some hermaphrodites can even self-fertilize, which is much less common in animals and much more common in plants, but it can happen. Some species have modes of sexual determination that are sensitive to the density of different sexes in the population. For instance, if you have a lot of males in the population, you're more likely to birth a female. An egg is more likely to become female, and sometimes you can control that through temperature of the nest, things like that. Some species undergo sex reversals over the course of their lifespan. So they either respond to the density of the population, or they just naturally switch, for instance, from male to female over the course of their lifespan. Certain flounders do that, certain oysters and reef fish. Once it's time for fertilization, you can either have external fertilization, where you essentially just release sperm, and they will find eggs that have been laid somewhere, and they will fertilize them, and then there you have a zygote that will grow. Or you can have internal fertilization, where you deposit the sperm into the female reproductive tract, and fertilization occurs inside the reproductive tract instead of externally. This occurs a lot more often in terrestrial organisms, where you'll see external fertilization more often in aquatic or marine organisms. It's easier to do this on dry land so things don't dry out. Now, there are some costs to this. It requires critical timing. You have to have, for instance, a female allow you to deposit sperm into her reproductive tract, and that can be difficult. For instance, if you're a spider and you are in danger of possibly being eaten by the female that's in front of you. So there are lots of precarious situations and pheromones and courtship behaviors and environmental cues involved that make this a little bit more complex. But it tends to lead to higher success of the zygote in terms of survival. And this is because you have essentially more time where the mother is protecting the offspring because it's inside her. And very often you get parental care once it leaves the mother's reproductive tract as well. So some organisms, once they lay the eggs, they're done. That's the extent of the parental care, is the nutrition that I gave you in the egg and the protection that I gave you, during the fertilization process. But for others, either you have internal development during the embryo and you have live birth later, like in humans. So that's a lot of investment on the mother's part. If any of you are mothers, you can attest to that. Or, for instance, here you have the eggs being carried on the back of this bug. A lot of wolf spiders do this too. This is a form of protecting the eggs and investing some care into them. With wolf spiders, very often, even after they hatch for the first week or two, they move around on the mother's back. And this is parental care that you don't see frequently in arthropods or spiders, but you do see in wolf spiders. And they will, as they get older, begin to go off and explore a little bit, but they keep a silk thread that goes back to a hair on the mother. And if there's danger, the mother's hairs will stiffen and they'll feel that tug and they all, scurry right back up on her back. It's cuter than it sounds, I promise. But however you fertilize, whether it's externally or internally, in order to fertilize, to reproduce sexually, you have to have gametes. And generally those gametes are made by specialized organs called gonads. Male gonads are typically called testes, and female gonads are typically called ovaries. And usually along with those gonads, you have a complex system of glands and tubes that help to nourish the gamete as it's being produced and deliver it where it needs to go, and then sometimes also nourish and protect the developing embryo. Here you can see the elaborate sets of tubes and glands that have evolved around the testis and the ovaries in fruit flies. And female fruit flies, like a lot of other arthropods, also have something called a spermatheca. And this is a place where they can store sperm. And this is handy if you are going to have the opportunity to mate with multiple males, maybe, and you don't necessarily know whether the first male that you mate with is going to be the best one. Maybe he was fine, right? But you're thinking you might find another male that was better and therefore has better genes, and you want to use that male's sperm. But if you don't, right, then you can just use the old male's sperm. So you store it here. And obviously males don't like this. Well, they're not thinking consciously, but evolutionarily this isn't beneficial to them, where the female could use somebody else's sperm. They want to be sure it's their sperm that's used. And so males have evolved in some species plugs that will block up the female's reproductive tract, so males have a hard time depositing sperm in her later. Sometimes that plug is just the tip of the male's penis. They'll break it off at the end, and they'll leave it there to block. Or sometimes males have scrapers on their penises that will scrape out other male sperm and semen when they're depositing their sperm and semen, so that they have more there. It's more likely to fertilize the eggs that she has inside her. Reproductive tracts have to be open to the outside world, maybe to receive sperm if you're fertilizing internally, but certainly to lay the egg. And very frequently, the opening to the reproductive system is also a common opening that opens as well to the excretory and digestive systems. So pee-pee, poo-poo, and eggs all from the same opening, and we call that a cloaca. You see these in arthropods, also birds, lizards, reptiles, things like that, just not mammals. We have separate openings. In animals, most animals, monogamy is relatively rare. Monogamy meaning where you have a male and a female that only reproduce together for their whole reproductive lives. It's not unheard of, but it's rare, and the reason is that females put a lot of investment energetically into eggs. They're big gametes, they cost a lot to make, and so females have a lot of investment in each individual reproductive event, whereas sperm are cheap. They're small, cheap gametes, and they're easy to make lots of, and so males are generally better served by playing a volume strategy, right? Quantity, whereas females play a quality strategy. And so males are less interested in any one event and more often want to have more events. Now, that's not always the case. It depends on other investments. So sometimes males will do more parental investment, and that can even things out. And that happens more often in birds and in humans, for instance, which have higher levels of monogamy or something closer to it. In fact, in some examples, like seahorses, for instance, males do most of the childcare and have more investment, and so it's actually females that tend to do more mating, and males are a little bit more choosy, instead of females being the choosy group and males being the showy group competing for access. And on that note, we're going to move on in the next video to talking about human reproductive systems, and we're going to look subsequently at the female first and then the male reproductive anatomy and physiology.